So again, thank you for joining today. And I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dawn at this time. Thank you very much for spending this time and preparing today, Dawn.
Hi, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Again, thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking about impact on waiting lists and sort of related topics to waiver redesign. Okay, so many of you have seen our My Life, My Community branding that appears at the top of this slide. This is what we've used to communicate related to the system redesign for the waivers for people with developmental disabilities. And this is our goal for the waiver redesign. Today what we're going to be talking about, first I'm just going to give you a quick overview of waiver redesign, a few of the elements. Then we're going to talk about screening process, give you an update on that. We're going to talk about combining the ID and DD waiver waiting list into a single waiting list, the priority setting process, the process to assign new waiver slots, and then just some information at the end about how to stay informed as we go along. So, quick overview. This slide shows the proposed integrated IDD waiver redesign. As many of you are already aware, we are taking the 3 current waivers to serve individuals with developmental disabilities inclusive of intellectual disabilities, and each is going to be followed by a successor waiver that has some of the same services, some new services, and some different focuses. So the day support waiver will become the building independence waiver, and that will be geared towards adults, those who are 18 and older, who are able to live independently in the community. The family and individual support waiver is the successor waiver to the current developmental disabilities waiver. So that's primarily for people living with their families, and in some cases their friends or their own home. The ID waiver becomes the community living waiver, and that does offer 24/7 residential services and supports for individuals with complex medical or behavioral support needs. So when do the changes begin? We hope July 1st, but this is of course pending approval from CMS. And some of the changes that we are anticipating, whether it's on July 1st or a little bit later, will be the amended waivers that include new services and new rates for the services. There will be new support levels and reimbursement tiers. There will be a new waiver management system replacing both IDLES and KeyPro as the means to authorize services, as well as to manage slots. The CSBs will assume their role as single point of entry for all of the DD waivers. The eligibility determiner for functional eligibility will be the revised tool, the VIDES, which is an acronym for the Virginia Individual Developmental Disability Eligibility Survey. And we will have a single statewide priority-based waiting list. I'm going to talk about a number of these elements in future slides. So first, the screening process update. This graphic shows the current process on the left of the red line and the revised process on the right of the red line. So currently we have 2 systems for individuals with developmental disabilities to access various waivers. So if an individual has an intellectual disability, they go through the CSB for eligibility determination and are then placed on an urgency-based waiting list, and they may receive the day support waiver or the intellectual disability waiver. Those with non-ID developmental disabilities are screened through the Child Development Clinic and are placed on a waiting list based on chronology and then have access only to the DD waiver. In the revised process, regardless of diagnosis, the screening will be conducted through the Community Services Board, who will determine eligibility. The person will be placed on a single consolidated waiting list that is based on urgency of need, and the individual will have access to services in one of the 3 waivers there, depending on their needs. So eligibility for the new revised DD waivers, individuals will have to possess a diagnosis of developmental disability as determined by a psychological or some other licensed professional evaluator. They will need to meet the functional eligibility or level of care as determined by the VIDE, and that's basically the ICF-ID level of care. And they'll continue to have to meet the Medicaid financial eligibility as determined by the Department of Social Services. In addition, individuals have to have waiver services be an appropriate alternative to them to an ICF-ID to either delay or avoid placement in that type of a setting or promote exiting an ICF-ID or other institutional setting. Now, if a slot is not available at the time that the person is screened, the support coordinator will place the person's name on the waiting list through the waiver management system, which we're calling WAM, and complete a form called a critical needs summary form. And that form will document the person's overall level of urgency and will be used when the slot assignment process is activated. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in future slides. The critical needs summary form is also related to an individual's priority needs level, which we'll also get to a little bit later on. So let's break this down a little bit more. The diagnostic eligibility will now be determined according to the Code of Virginia definition of developmental disability, which we have borrowed from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disability. I'm not going to read the whole definition, but you will have that here on the slide, this slide and the next slide. So the person must meet all of the various criteria here and on this second slide. In response to requests from our stakeholders, CDHDS is developing a guidance check sheet to assist staff, CSB staff, to ensure that the elements of this new definition are present when they are screening individuals for waiver services. And that guidance check sheet will be made available shortly. In terms of functional eligibility, as I mentioned, we are moving from the current level of functioning survey that we've used for many years to the VIDEs. In developing the VIDEs and field testing it, we determined that we really needed to have 3 separate versions. We thought we were going to have a children's version and an adult's version. It had been requested to have a children's version for many years because most children would meet the level of functioning survey and now the VIDEs, regardless of whether they had a disability or not. So when we field tested the revised adults version and the children's version, we realized that we also needed a separate version for infants. So we now have 3 versions. The language for all of them has been updated to be more person-centered. We've removed all institutional types of references. Initially, the LOF talked about a person navigating around the ward and the cottage and those sorts of things because the LOF was initially developed for individuals living in institutions. And we've added to the children's and the adults version a section on self-determination, which folks who have reviewed the VIDEs have thought to be very helpful. The infants version has been based on the American Pediatric Association's developmental milestones for children who are under 3. So there are certain questions that are asked in the infants and the children depending on the age of either the infant or the child. So it's really geared towards age appropriate. which will, I think, be very helpful. As I mentioned, we field tested all of these different versions using both ID and DD staff who are familiar with the LOS, and we compared the results against the LOS and utilized the results to make the changes in the tool. We've also developed a PowerPoint training module for staff who will be administering the VIVE, and that has been disseminated out to the waiver experts at the community services boards, and all of the different case managers who will be utilizing the VIVEs will receive training through that module. So we'll be using the VIVE on individuals in the combined waiting list for the distribution of the FY17 slot, and the VIVE will also be used for anybody who is screened initially in the future for the amended waivers, as well as annual reassessment of functional eligibility once the amended waivers take place. So the VIVE will take place with the LOS as a tool that gets used on an annual basis to reconfirm individuals' eligibility. All right, let's talk about combining the waiting list. So I'm just going to go ahead and show all of these right now. It's easier. So all amended waivers, as I said, will serve individuals with DD diagnosis, inclusive of ID. The CSVs will be the single point of entry in the system for all individuals with developmental disabilities seeking waiver services, and they will confirm diagnostic and functional eligibility at the CSV initially for each person, and then place people on the single statewide waiting list if a slot isn't available for that person immediately upon screening. The waiver waiting list, although statewide, will be maintained regionally by the local CSV for individuals under their jurisdiction, including those who are currently associated with DD case management agencies. The waiting list will have oversight from the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services Division of Developmental Services staff. So DBHDS has called regional support specialists. There are currently 5, one for each of our 5 regions, and we are going to be hiring a second one for the Northern Virginia region. And these staff will ensure that individuals are added to the waiver waiting list appropriately. So merging the waiting list. Right now, as I mentioned before, we've got one waiting list for individuals with an ID diagnosis that's based on urgency of need, and one for the other individuals with developmental disabilities based on chronology. So we need to merge those into one waiting list. In order to do that, we will be prioritizing individuals' needs so that we will have a single waiting list that's based on prioritization of need. So I would just urge you to think of priorities 1, 2, and 3 as sort of how one might receive services if you walked into a busy emergency room. If there are 100 people in the ER at the same time and they all have, urgent needs, some will have to be seen. So we are triaging individuals. So you might have people who need to be seen within the hour. In our system, that would be the priority 1 individual. There may be those who can wait for 2 hours. Those would be the priority 2, and those who could hold out for maybe 4 hours or 5 hours, and those would be the priority 3 individuals. As we add capacity in our system, or even as demand reduces due to people's needs being met through other means, such as rental assistance or through crisis services or our individual and family services program, that lets other individuals be served, individuals who may be in other priority categories. Okay, so seamless procedures, increasing consistency. We, as I mentioned, have our 5 currently and soon to be 6 regional support specialists, and they will assist CSBs to manage the waiting list. And they will also support the waiver slot assignment committee. So the amended waivers separate the CSBs as the eligibility determiners of the system from entities that actually assigns the slot. So that is a difference between how things are done currently in the ID waiver system, where the CSBs have managed both the eligibility determination and the slot assignment. Now, slot assignment committees, the WSAC, we call them, are made up of trained volunteers from each locality who will be assigning those slots based on urgency of need. The individuals who are in priority 1 will be the individuals who will be essentially screened for slot assignment based on their score on that critical needs summary form that I mentioned earlier. So those with the highest scores on the critical needs summary form will be the ones who will be reviewed for slots as slots become available, either through the action of the General Assembly or as slots turn over. The members of the WSAC are not affiliated with the CSB or a private provider. We have established criteria that they may not be employees. Currently, they may be somebody who was known to the CSB or affiliated with them in the past, but not currently. They may not be individuals or family members who have somebody on the waiver waiting list. And there's a number of other criteria as well. They should be knowledgeable of and have experience with persons with developmental disabilities or the DD service system. And our specialists will support the waiver selection committees and the assigning of slots. So currently, the CSBs have nominated individuals from their region to DBHDS, and we've gotten nominees from almost every region at this point. Some nominees haven't met criteria. We reviewed all of their applications, and frankly, some, we will have to say, I'm sorry, don't meet our criteria right now. Some are determined to have some sort of a conflict, so we are scrutinizing all of the applications carefully. We are also going to be encouraging more CSBs to combine. We've got a number of CSBs who have combined, ones who are neighboring, combining to form a single or a joint WSAC so that our regional support specialists are able to adequately staff all of the different committees. We've currently got 29 WSACs, and we're hoping for a few less than that. There's information about the WSAC and the application for membership at that website on the slide. All right, let's go over to priority setting process. This slide shows the criteria for an individual to be priority 1. So basically, the individuals who are to be priority 1 need to have a need for waiver service within the next year. And some of these criteria are very similar to the urgent criteria that we used in the ID waiver in the past. So the idea of an immediate jeopardy to the health and safety of the individual due to their primary caregiver basically having, some physical or psychiatric conditions that are limiting their ability to care for them. That's very similar to the wording in the current urgent needs criteria. And the same thing for number 2, a risk to the health or safety of the applicant or the primary caregiver or somebody else living in the home because the person's behaviors or medical needs present a risk or cannot continue to be managed by that caregiver. We've added that the individual lives in an institutional setting and has a viable discharge plan. currently, due to the settlement agreement with DOJ, we have slots that are set aside for those who are moving from facilities, but that may not always be the case. And we do want to be in compliance with Olmstead, so that's a priority one category. We've also added that the individual may be a young adult transitioning from school and no longer being eligible for school services, so that we don't have young adults sort of languishing at home. Now, related to that last criterion, after age 27, that will no longer apply. So those who have not received a slot and hit age 27 will no longer be priority one unless they meet one of the other criteria. Priority two, this is for those who need services in 1 to 5 years. And we're looking at the health and safety of the individual likely to be in future jeopardy, or the individual being at risk of losing employment or their housing due to lack of support. And then the fourth category there, individual has needs or desired outcomes that with adequate supports will result in a significantly improved quality of life. We're specifically put in for those individuals who may have supports at home or living with their family, but they would like to live in the community more independently, perhaps through the Building Independence Waiver, living in their own apartments. So they would like to be able to grow and become more independent and utilize the waiver that way. And then lastly, eligibility priority 3 is sort of an active planning list. So that is for those who would need access to a waiver slot more than 5 years out. The system should plan for that person's future needs, as that person could present at any time. We realize that individuals in priority 3 or even 2 can move up to priority 1 at any time related to the death of a caregiver or just a major change in their status. So for this one, we have criteria for these receiving funding perhaps through another funding source. The individual is not currently receiving a service but is likely to need one. And then number 3 is the same as number 4 under priority 2. So this is for people who would like to have an improved quality of life by being supported a little bit more independently in the community. So currently our activities related to prioritization are that the CSCs and private case managers and DBHCS staff are working towards completing prioritization on all individuals on the existing ID and DD waiver waiting list. We are also working towards completing the VIDEs on all individuals who are then determined to meet the priority 1 category. The VIDEs will need to ultimately be completed on all individuals on the waiting list, but we're focusing right now on those who are determined to be priority 1 to ensure that those folks meet functional eligibility and prepare for the distribution of the General Assembly funded FY17 new slot. DBHCS staff are actively involved in offering assistance wherever requested in order to get these things accomplished. We will be notifying individuals on the current DD waiver waiting list about the 200 slots that were funded for those current DD waiver waiting list folks by the General Assembly this past session. So as those slots are distributed, the remaining individuals on the DD waiver chronological list will be formally notified of the merging of the waiting list in their priority level. We wanted to wait until those slots were distributed because we're likely going to be reaching further down than number 200 on that chronological waiting list because we've already had some individuals, as we've reached out to them, we found out that they either died or they moved out of state or they may be declining the slot or whatever. So we will likely be serving more than 200 individuals, and then whoever is remaining will be notified of the merging of the waiting list. The individuals who are on the current ID waiver chronological list who move from urgent needs to priority 2 or 3 will be offered appeal rights. Let me stop at this point and see if there are any questions. We'll take a few.
Well, Don, as you might imagine, we have some really good questions here. We'll maybe take the first 10 and then let you continue on. I'll try to combine. First, Don's PowerPoint will be available after the webinar. You'll get an email message about that. The webinar is being recorded, and information about how to access the webinar recording will be sent to everyone who registered for the webinar. Don, we have a question that you haven't covered the topic of WAMs, but people are asking, is there going to be training for WAMs? Could you briefly state what WAMs is and answer the training question?
Sure. So WAMs is our acronym for the Waiver Management System, which is what we're calling the replacement for IDLES, the current service authorization and slot management system for the ID waiver, as well as the KeyPro system, a Trezzo that manages the service authorization for the DD waiver. So we have, DBHDS has contracted with an agency called SEI, and they are building a new system for us that will include the slot management, service authorization capabilities, and reporting capabilities, and hopefully just a lot of things that our current system don't permit. The WAM system is being rolled out in phases. The first phase is supposed to be live July 1st, and that will include waiting list management as well as service authorization to enable providers to get paid and individuals to be authorized. The second phase will be rolled out, I think, sometime in mid to late December, and then the third phase next March. So there will be other elements added as we go along. The training on the utilization of WAM will take place starting in mid-June. We want to make it as close as possible to the go-live date. If we do it too soon, then people will probably forget how to use that. So that was at the recommendation of SEI, who's done this sort of thing in other states. We are process of user acceptance training, testing, user acceptance testing, UAT, where DBHDS staff test some of the elements that SEI has built. Once we've done that, we will move to user acceptance testing by CSPs and private agencies as well. So we want to make sure that everything works also before we do any sort of training. And that will be coming up prior to the go-live date.
Thank you, Dawn. Are copies of the VIDES available online?
Not currently, but we are going to be placing them there. Just haven't done it yet, that's all.
Do people who have waiver services now have to be re-screened every year?
People who have waiver services currently must be re-screened in terms of their functional eligibility every year. That's been a long-standing requirement. So the level of functioning survey has either been completed by the CSP case manager, or for those on the DD waiver, that has been completed by DBHDS DD analysts. So that is something that will continue. That's a CMS requirement. They want to ensure that people still meet the functional eligibility for the waiver. So now it will be done annually utilizing the VIDE.
Dawn, the next question is a very specific question, but I think it will have applicability to several people, quite a few. The individual's question is that their child has been screened for the DD waiver waiting list over a year ago. They've been on the waiting list. The child's recent school triennial eligibility committee, so the school's eligibility committee, changed the child's eligibility category for the purposes of special education to ID, intellectual disability. How will assignment of priority be handled?
That will have no effect on the prioritization. And now that we will have one waiting list, it really won't have any effect on the person's place in that waiting list. Because the waiting list involves people with ID, and non-ID developmental disabilities. They will just, that child will simply be on the waiting list. The prioritization is not done according to diagnosis at all, but according to those criteria on the slide that I showed a few minutes ago. So that child may be priority 1 or maybe priority 2 or priority 3, but the actual change due to the school system has no bearing on that.
Thank you. Will people now living with their family be candidates for the individual and family support waiver as their needs change? And, you know, would they later then be eligible for the community living waiver, again, as their needs change?
Yes. So individuals who are living with their families, perhaps in the DD waiver, would move directly to the Family Individual Supports waiver. And if their needs should change such that they require the services and support in the community living waiver, we are planning on having some reserved slots, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation, that individuals can access to move to that waiver. By the same token, individuals could move from either the community living waiver or the Family Individual Supports waiver to the building independence waiver, should they desire to live in their own apartment and receive support there. And we really encourage that.
Don, what is acceptable documentation for priority 1?
Well, right now the prioritization is taking place through getting in touch with individuals, their families, to determine if they meet, you know, the different priority categories. So, you know, we would just need to determine if there is some sort of, you know, immediate jeopardy related to a physical or psychiatric condition of the caregiver. So there would just need to be something that demonstrates that. That doesn't necessarily mean we're looking for a doctor's note or anything like that, but there does need to be, you know, some serious condition that's going to limit that caregiver's ability. Same thing for number 2, the risk to the health or safety because of behavior. There would need to be some sort of documented history of that person having challenging behaviors that present some sort of a risk to themselves or others, or serious medical needs that are just more than that person's caregivers can handle. So a lot of it is going to be very individual specific, and we're not only querying individuals, but case managers who have worked with individuals for a long time are aware of their needs. Will probably have documentation of these sorts of things in their records, perhaps through referrals to REACH for crisis services or other types of needs.
Today's webinar is focused on the 3 DD waivers. There is a question, though, in regard to the elderly or disabled with consumer direction waiver. Will that process or services for the EDCD waiver be impacted by these changes?
No.
Where can we find out what our current DD waiver waiting list number is?
As I mentioned, the individuals who are at the very top of the list have already been or will be soon contacted about those 200 slots. So we've contacted a number of people already, left messages for people. You know, we're doing our very best to get in touch with everybody at the very top of that list. And then as soon as we have made all of those contacts and essentially distributed or assigned those new slots, then we will be sending out letters to individuals about the prioritization. There's not really a need at this point to let people know anything about their number, you know, after this point, because that will be irrelevant. They will no longer be on a waiting list based on chronology, but will be based on their priority 1, 2, or 3.
Are individuals notified in writing of their priority status once it's determined, and are they being given copies of the completed VIDEs?
They can receive a copy of the VIVE. It's something that would be part of their record, so they would have access to whatever is in their record. I don't know that we have a particular dissemination plan, but that could be requested through their case manager. In terms of the priority score, yes, individuals will be made aware of that. In particular, those, and I've got some questions actually out to DMS right now about appeals letters, but some individuals will be offered the right to appeal, particularly if they're moving from, let's say, the ID waiver waiting list urgent criteria to priority 2 or priority 3, because that sort of moves them a little bit further away from the ability to access the slot. And then I've got some questions out about what needs to happen in terms of appeals notification to those on the current ID waiver waiting list. So I may have to defer that a little bit until I get the responses back.
Okay, and 2 more questions, and Don, I'm going to let you continue on. We do have a number of other questions, but again, we will either take them at the end of the webinar or be responding to them in writing. How do the priorities work in relationship to other waivers? And I think the question is more when once you receive you have a priority, how is it determined which waiver you're going to go to, since waiver, they'll all have waiting list, or there'll be one waiting list?
Right, there is one waiting list. The prioritization really doesn't have anything to do with which waiver. That just determines whether the individual can sort of be moved forward for consideration of an available slot by the waiver slot assignment committee. So as I mentioned, those who are priority 1 would be the ones who have a critical needs summary form completed on them, and some other forms that would then be relayed to the WSAC for consideration of the urgency of their need for a waiver slot. There will be a different process for determining which waiver the individual has access to. I've got a slide on that, but I'll just let you know, disclaimer right now, we're still sort of working out some of the details on that, so I'm not going to have a lot of information on that presently.
What if an individual currently has the day support waiver? Will that continue, or is there a possibility of the waiver being taken away?
The individuals on the day support waiver who are under 18 will no longer be eligible for that waiver, but we already have a plan to move those individuals, and it's just a handful of children, move them to the family individual support waiver. So we've got that already planned out, and then those individuals who are on the day support waiver and would like to access some of the other services that are available in the building independence waiver will absolutely, remain in the building independence waiver. If individuals, for one reason or another, need to move to the family individual support or the community living waiver, at some point in the future, that's what we will have reserved slots for.
Thank you. I'd like to encourage people to continue to put their questions in. And Dawn, I'm going to turn it back over to you to continue with the presentation.
Okay, thanks. All right, so talking about the process to assign new waiver slots. Go ahead and get this all on there. So in order to be considered for slot assignment, the person does need to meet the diagnostic and functional eligibility requirements for the waiver, which we've already gone over. They must meet one of the priority 1 categories. They must need services within 30 days and be willing to accept the requested service if it were offered. And in the case of a child, that 4th bullet there would be acceptance of the individual's parents of the slot for their child. So the process is that when the CSC has slots available for assignment, they're going to contact the WSAC facilitator. Each waiver slot assignment committee will have one person who's sort of a lead person, who we're calling a facilitator, and that person will call a meeting of that area's WSAC, and the CSC will put forth the top scoring individuals based on that critical needs summary form. And there's a formula for how many individuals are put forth depending on how many slots are available. So for example, if there are less than 5 slots available, the WSAC is going to review the top 10 scoring critical needs summary individuals. If there's more than 5 available, then they're going to review twice the number of individuals as available slots. So, you know, if you happen to have 20 slots because the General Assembly has just assigned new slots, then 40 individuals will be reviewed for those slots. The case managers, inclusive of private case managers for people who are currently on the DD waiver waiting list, will complete another form called the Slot Assignment Review Form. It just gives a lot more detail about what the current needs are of that individual, what types of resources they have in terms of natural support or other paid support, things that the WSAC needs to know in order to determine, you know, who has a real urgent need at the time that the slot is available. So they review that, and they also have access to the individual case manager in order to ask questions at the meeting. Our DBHDS regional support specialist will attend those meetings as the state observer to ensure that processes are followed and ensure consistency across the state. The WSAC members will score the urgency of needs of all the individuals that are presented on another form called the Slot Assignment Scoring Summary, Step 2 Review, and the individual or individuals with the highest scores receive the available slot. After the determination of a slot assignment is made, then through the assistance of the regional support specialist, the enrollment into the waiver slot will occur in WAM. So that's sort of a new process. We're still working with FBI on the details of how that's going to work sort of procedurally, but basically the CSB and the regional support specialists will each have a role in ensuring that an individual has the slot that meets that person's needs. Now, this is a slide that sort of gets to one of the questions, you know, which person to which waiver. The process is still under some consideration, some discussion. We've got a transition issues work group made up of stakeholders that has provided DBHDS and DMAS with recommendations. And in fact, there was a meeting of DBHDS and DMAS staff today to talk a little bit more about the current recommendations, and we'll be able to release more information about the process for that sometime in the very near future. As I mentioned, there will be reserved slots. There will be 2 types. There will be reserved slots to support emergencies as well as to support movement between the waivers, and those reserved slots are managed by DBHDS. So if an individual is on the statewide waiting list, or even somebody who was previously unknown and not on the waiting list, but they are determined to have a true emergency that can't be resolved through the community resource consultant, the regional support team, or something we call the C3T, which is a DBHDS team that comes together to try to determine the best path to resolve an individual's emergency. If none of those resources can successfully resolve the situation, an emergency slot may be made available to that person. Those emergency slots will not be repaid by the CSC until the number of available emergency slots has reached 10% of the existing emergency slots, or at a minimum 3 slots. And at that point, repayment with the next available community slot or turnover slot will be required so that we don't completely deplete our emergency slot pool within a fiscal year. The reserve slots are for movement between waivers, and they're there to support people who are already receiving services in one of the three waivers and experience a significant change in their assessed needs that require services that are available in a different waiver, or who choose to move to a more independent setting. So particularly individuals who are choosing to move towards the building independence waiver will have reserved slots for that waiver so that individuals can live in their own apartment, receive support there, perhaps receive some funding as well to support their living in that apartment setting. The emergency slots are accessed through the following criteria. Either a child protective services or adult protective services substantiated abuse or neglect against a primary caregiver, so that the individual has to be removed from the home, or for adults where abuse or neglect hasn't been substantiated, but there is pretty solid corroborating information from other sources that there's an inherent risk present and there's nobody else to provide support to that individual. An emergency slot may be available. Or the second criteria would be a death of a primary caregiver or lack of some alternate caregiver coupled with the individual's inability to care for him or herself that then presents a danger if supports were not offered. So that is, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't have that part up there. That's the criteria for utilization of the emergency slots. All right, and then finally, further updates about My Life, My Community are available at our DBHDS website. We also are real proud to have a toll-free number that can be utilized if you have particular questions that's staffed during the day. And we are going to be initiating an interactive website later on in the month that people will be able to go to in order to get certain questions answered. So it will be sort of a decision tree type of activated website, and we'll make an announcement out when that's up and live. So, and here is our website for My Life, My Community, where we will post additional updates as they are available. And that's all I have.
Great, Dawn. That's a lot of information, and I really appreciate you pulling this together. Of course, there's a lot of questions. We have reached the 12:40, gone past a little bit, the 12:45 time. I have two questions I'd like to ask you, Dawn, that have come forward in the chat. I would ask people to continue typing in their questions. Once we've ended the webinar, the question box will remain open, so you can still ask your questions, and remind everyone that we will be sending out the responses within 2 weeks. The two questions are, a family is planning on starting the screening process soon. Should they start the process now, or should they wait until July?
That really is a personal decision. If they are the individual in the family has an intellectual disability, then certainly they can move forward with the Community Services Board. If the individual has a non-intellectual but developmental disability, the child development clinics are still supposed to be taking referrals for screening. At some point, probably in mid to late June, they will cease that so that they can complete all of their screening work and then turn over things to the Community Services Board. So you just really have to decide what you want to do there.
Dawn, this last question is a two-part question. Individuals who were on the DD waiver waiting list who are receiving one of the 200 slots funded by the General Assembly this year, Will they be enrolled in the DD waiver, or can they choose one of the other two waivers?
They will be enrolled in the DD waiver. That was the stipulation of the General Assembly. So if there is not a choice there, because we're going by chronology and they're going into the existing DD waiver, once the amended waivers take effect, they will then also sort of move along with everybody else into the family individual supports waiver.
Once an individual receives a slot, let's say it's this summer based on the priority setting that's being done right now for the new combined one waiver, one waiting list. Once they are assigned a slot, because they're the highest priority in that region, how is it determined which of the three waivers they will receive?
Yeah, that goes back to the slide number 28 that has a little under construction clip art, and we will be releasing more information about that shortly.
Thank you very much, Dawn. Well, this concludes our webinar for today. We will have a second webinar on May 18th. Dawn Traver has agreed to present that webinar as well. It will focus on the waivers in the new redesign. That webinar will also be recorded. We hope you have registered, and if not, please do so. I'm going to conclude the webinar at this time. The webinar will be posted. It's being recorded, and we will also be sending you the Q&A and the PowerPoint that Dawn has presented today. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and very much to Dawn. I am going to stop the recording and I'm going to stop the audio. We will leave it live for you to continue to post any questions you have for the next 10 minutes. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.